Alright, I'm back, and today we're going to talk about Lecture 35, Gilded Age Politics, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on politics. We talk about the political spectrum and how things are changing a little bit more. But this time around, I just really want to talk about the process of politics and how politics was played out in the Gilded Age. That kind of made the Gilded Age the Gilded Age. So what we're going to do today is going to analyze the influence of trusts and political machines on Gilded Age politics, which, I didn't put the little corresponding thing. Oh, well, we're going to move on anyway. Now, basically what was going on during this time is the politics had gotten kind of strange. Before the Civil War, of course, the politics was a little bit clearer. You had the Whigs and you had the Democrats, and the Whigs, of course, tended to stand for, Northern industrialists, whereas the Democrats tended to stand for, manifest destiny and the Southern plantation owners. And, of course, there was this current of abolitionism going on. But for the most part, of course, by the time the Civil War ended, of course, there was no more Whig party. The country had split apart. And slavery, probably the biggest political issue of the 19th century, had been resolved. Slavery was ended. Consequently, it was pretty clear that industry was a way to go. There was, for the most part, a general consensus on economic issues. The country was growing, the economy was expanding, and a lot of people kind of like to keep things the status quo and keep things the way they were. Also we also saw some reforms and resentments with regard to Reconstruction. These were the elements that were coming together to kind of shape politics in the late 19th century. So consequently, what we do start to see is, well, many of the people who were largely considered to be liberal in the beginning of the 19th century are going to kind of shift into, they win. For the most part, they win. And will ultimately end up becoming, being considered rather conservative. And then the consequences of how they won and what they won, and the growth of with regard to the growth of industry, the expansion of trust. Of course, the early liberals, kind of saw investments in industry and investments in what was called the American system was the way to go, and largely keeping, government out of other economic factors, but driving this industrial machine. They win. But by the late 19th century, there started to be some problems with this. We started to see the accumulation of wealth and the accumulation of power in the hands of trusts and the hands of corporations. And there's going to be a bit of a backlash on this. So then we have to start to consider, well, exactly what do we mean by liberalism, and how is liberalism going to be shaped by this process in the United States? We're going to get into that more in depth in the next lecture. We talk about social movements and the political spectrum. Well, for the most part, as far as the United States was concerned, there was pretty much a consensus on how the country should be run. For the most part, there wasn't really all that huge a debate. So consequently, the areas where there were differences was in who was going to support these individual parties. These parties were based largely on geography and who were the traditional parties in a particular region, and also based on the demographics of that region and which parties that they supported. And there wasn't necessarily going to be a huge debate over the particular policies. It was more a matter of a debate over which parties were going to implement pretty close to the same policies that were existed. Now, a lot of this had to do with the one difference here. The one difference actually is tariffs. The tariff is now going to become a very large issue, a very big issue, and we're going to see some differences here. But for the most part, what were factors during this time? What we see is a tremendous growth of government. Government is going to expand, and a lot of this had to do with the Civil War. The expansion of the federal government in order to fight the war, and then the continued expansion of the federal government in order to deal with Reconstruction. But we also have some other areas here which government is going to take a more central role. Remember, historically in American society, the role of government in people's lives was supposed to be relatively limited. with maybe the Hamiltons and and that particular group, the Federalists, and later the Whigs, maybe saying maybe there should be a greater role of the government in people's individual lives, with the Democrats saying, well, no, we don't want to have any of this going on in the early 19th century. We don't want to have that. Well, now we have a situation in which, well, the government is just going to have to be a little bit more involved. The government's going to have to grow because the society is growing and society is becoming more complex. And we see that with the cities. For instance, as cities grow, we see that the demands for services in those cities are also going to grow. So, for instance, as the population in cities get, imagine you have to have somebody maintaining the roads and building more roads and building greater infrastructure. And what about sewage and drainage and sanitation? Putting out fires. Fires are a huge, huge threat to the cities. What about hiring a professional police force? Well, all of this stuff takes money. It takes taxes. So that means cities are going to have to raise taxes in order to get these particular services. And when you raise taxes to get these particular services, you have to have bureaucracies in place to channel and funnel, to collect the money first of all, and then to channel and funnel that money to the places where it's supposed to go, and to do this relatively efficiently. And many of these cities were growing much, much faster than they could accommodate the people that were involved. Also, at the national level, especially the expansion of railroads is going to increase the demand for government services. I mean, government is going to have to really kind of take a central position, because now we have railroads that are traveling across the country. We have to set time zones, and we have to maintain the tracks, and we have these huge land dispersions that we've sent out. We have an increase in interstate commerce, products being shifted from across the country. And, of course, we have an expansion of even global trade going on as a result of this, which means that there's going to be more responsibility for governments. Government is going to have to play a role in this. So what we do see is an expansion of some of the federal government and the responsibilities of the federal government. So, for instance, we see, because of the expansion of farming and the large agricultural combines that were developing out in the West, we see a Department of Agriculture forming in order to organize agriculture and train people in agricultural arts and sciences and things like that. We have the Morrill Land Grants. So there was a lot of stuff that had to be done with regard to agriculture. We have the Department of the Interior. The federal government now had in its hands tremendous amounts of land and resources. And what do we do with those resources? And also we had responsibility over growing numbers of Native American tribes. And how do we deal with these tribes? So, of course, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to come under the Interior Department. We have... with the growth of interstate commerce, of course, interstate commerce is something that the Constitution says the federal government has to be a part of, and should be a part of, and consequently the Treasury Department is going to have to expand, and it's going to have to expand, and even as a result of the Civil War, for instance, and the United States issuing greenbacks. Ultimately, those greenbacks will be recalled, but that created a tremendous amount of responsibility on the part of the Treasury Department. So, another thing going on at this time, of course, we had a relatively strong president with Abraham Lincoln, but the presidents who followed Abraham Lincoln, right up until maybe President McKinley, were relatively weak presidents. For the most part, it's going to be Congress that is going to be doing most of the bulwark with regard to governing at the national level at this point in time. So we see the growth of government happening at this point, and a foundational element of politics in the Gilded Age was something that was called the political machines. And in essence, the political machines were institutions within municipalities, cities, and communities, mostly in cities, that pretty much organized the political process in those communities. So if you wanted to get yourself elected, what you would have to do is you'd have to ingratiate yourself to one of these political bosses who were the heads of these political machines. And once you did that, once you got yourself there, the political boss would then run your campaign. He would go to various districts and businesses, collect funds, put out posters, take down posters of any of your competitors, buy off people that needed to be bought off, and make sure that your pamphlets and brochures and everything got around, and make sure that everybody in the city knew that you were the guy that needed to be elected. And then consequently, once you were elected, of course, you had to stay on the boss's good side, and the boss would make it a point to go out to the various communities in the city and find out what they needed, and make sure that you answered to those constituencies, especially when those constituencies had lots and lots of money, but not always. Sometimes it was a numbers game. We had to bring numbers of people into the booths, into the voting booths at this point. So these political machines are the ones that were organizing a lot of this. Now you can kind of see, probably the biggest example of this is the Tammany Hall political machine in New York that was led by a fellow by the name of Boss William Tweed. These political leaders were known as bosses. Roscoe Conkling was another one. These very, very large political machines that would help getting, especially in New York, you had ended up with very, very important political leaders getting elected. Now, it turned out that Boss Tweed, you can kind of see where there would be the opportunity for swindling and for skullduggery going on here. A lot of corruption was taking place in these political machines. And at this time, there was a political cartoonist. His name was Thomas Nast, and he learned about some of the political shenanigans of Boss Tweed, and he started putting political cartoons out showing the corruption of Boss Tweed. He always represented Boss Tweed as this bulbous, bilious kind of rotund man chomping on a cigar. He was pretty close to that. And just highlighting the corruption of the Tweed Ring. And ultimately, the Tweed Ring will be brought down. There will be a public clamor to bring Tammany Hall down. And the prosecuting attorney will be a fellow by the name of Samuel Tilden, and Boss Tweed's corruption will be, pretty much destroyed. But that didn't end the corruption of these political machines in general. It just took down one guy. We remember Samuel Tilden in the Hayes-Tilden election, as well as Samuel Tilden became very, very popular because of this. But I think this is a great story because it was a cartoonist who really brought down the Tweed Ring. Now, another thing that we see going on with regard to these political machines is patronage. Okay, if you wanted to get elected, you needed to have the bosses on your side. So the boss would kind of select the people whom they believed were electable, charismatic people, but also they were going to select people who weren't going to buck and try to try to create reforms and to try to buck the political machine system. You'd want somebody who was very, very docile. So this was an example of patronage, where the bosses became the patrons of the elected officials, and then the elected officials would then do them favors. We see as a result of these political machines that one of the ways of getting the votes from people was to guarantee jobs for certain people, of course, within the political machine. So somebody helps me get elected, and I create a job for him somewhere, in the city. Or the political boss comes along and says, "Okay, well, what we'll do is we're gonna create this job. Your job is going to be to make sure all the clocks in the government buildings are set." So you run around and you get a huge wage, and you run around the city and you make sure, yep, that clock is set. Yep, that clock is set. And that's your job. So this was called a spoil system. Basically, my political supporters would get jobs. Some of these jobs were legitimate, some of the jobs were, but this was the spoils system. So again, we see a lot of potential for some abuse here. Now, for the most part, the political parties really didn't have all that much in the way of differences, except for maybe who their constituencies were. For the most part, tariffs were probably the central debate at this time, with those parties that were more of a pro-industrialists supporting high tariffs. Whereas those parties, mostly the Republicans for the most part supported the relatively high tariffs, because these high tariffs protected industrialists. They protected the factory owners. So, for instance, if there was a factory in England that was able to produce goods cheaper than my factory, well, what we would do is we would impose a tariff on those goods, which would raise the cost of those goods, and that would make it more so that I could compete against that British manufacturer. So the tariffs made my products more competitive and also increased my profit margin. So I was all about tariffs. But those parties that tended to support farmers and workers tended to not like high tariffs, because high tariffs tended to raise prices and raise costs for consumers. So this was the big debate: how high should the tariffs be? And we also see some cultural, mostly the differences between these parties are going to be cultural and ethnic. So for instance, if we take a look down here at the Republicans were, they oftentimes use what was called the bloody shirt. They would put out politicians who had an important role in the Civil War, and because of their role in the Civil War, they became very, very popular, and they would get elected hands down. Of course, this was one of the ways that they got Ulysses S. Grant elected president of the United States. What was Ulysses S. Grant's qualification to be president? None. He was a failure in just about everything he tried, except fighting the Civil War, and consequently, they call it waving the bloody shirt, and he